Mencius was a man who knew how to enter a room. He had studied the ancient rites, learned the proper postures, understood the weight that silence could carry if positioned correctly between two statements of principle. When he came before King Hui of Liang, a king who was, at that moment, conducting a war on three borders simultaneously, he did not flatter and he did not equivocate. He told the king that if a man loved benevolence and governed justly, the people would come to him as water flows downward, which is to say, inevitably, which is to say, without any force required. The king listened. The king was polite. The king was also, in the weeks that followed, still conducting his war. This was the world Zhuangzi was born into, not a philosophical backdrop, not a historical footnote, but a living condition, the particular texture of a time when the old order had collapsed far enough that every serious thinker alive could feel the ground shifting beneath the arguments they were making. The Zhou dynasty, which had once held China together through a system of feudal loyalty, organized around ritual propriety and ceremonial obligation, had been losing coherence for centuries. What remained was a collection of competing states, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own claim to legitimacy, and its own appetite for the territory of the others. Philosophers moved between these states the way physicians once moved between courts, offering their services, their theories, their visions of the correct way to organize human life, hoping to find a ruler willing to implement what they had worked out. Some of them found their audiences. Most of them found polite dismissal. The wars continued regardless. The period had a name that carried its own argument within it. The Warring States, which ran from roughly the 5th century before the Common Era until the unification of China under the Qin in 221, was not merely a time of military conflict. It was a period in which the failure of one organizing vision of human society had left the field open to every competing alternative simultaneously. The result was what later historians would call the 100 schools of thought, not 100 in any literal count, but the name given to the remarkable proliferation of philosophical positions, each offering its own account of what human beings were, what they owed each other, and what kind of arrangement would allow them to live well. Confucians argued for ritual and hierarchy and the recovery of ancient virtue. Mosists argued for universal love and a kind of proto-utilitarian accounting of benefit and harm. Legalists argued for strict law and absolute state authority. And then, at a certain angle to all of them, there were the thinkers who would later be gathered under the name Daoists, who argued, if argued is even the right word, that the whole problem had been set up wrongly from the beginning. It is into this landscape, turbulent and richly argumentative, that Zhuangzi arrives. His dates are uncertain. Scholars place him somewhere around 369 to 286 before the Common Era, making him roughly contemporary with Mencius, though the two men appear to have inhabited entirely different philosophical universes. His given name was Zhou. He held a minor official position in the state of Meng, managing what the texts describe as a lacquer garden or lacquer tree plantation, a post of modest practical responsibility and no political consequence to speak of. Whether this position was something he sought or something he found himself in through circumstance, the texts do not say clearly. What they do say, with some confidence, is that when offers of higher office came, and they did come, he declined them. He declined them more than once. The most often cited account places him at the edge of a river, fishing, when two envoys arrive from the state of Chu, bearing an offer of high ministerial appointment. The story Zhuangzi tells them in response involves a sacred turtle, one that has been dead for 3,000 years, and whose shell is kept wrapped in silk in the royal ancestral hall, venerated, and consulted for divination. He asks the envoys, would that turtle, if it could choose, prefer to be dead and venerated in the ancestral hall, or alive and dragging its tail through the mud? The envoys, somewhat bewildered, say it would surely prefer to be alive. Zhuangzi tells them to leave him alone. Then, he will drag his tail through the mud. The story has the quality of a man who has already settled something. There is no anguish in it, no heroic renunciation, no dramatic weighing of possibilities. The refusal arrives as if the question had been anticipated long before the envoys appeared at the riverbank, as if the answer had been worked out in some earlier and quieter moment of reflection, and what the envoys were receiving was only the announcement of a conclusion already arrived at. This is one of the qualities that distinguishes Zhuangzi from the other philosophers of his era, who also found themselves in tension with the demands of political life. His refusals do not read as sacrifices, they read as consistency. What was he consistent with? The question opens into the whole of his philosophy, but its simplest form is this. Zhuangzi believed that the natural movement of a living being, its spontaneous, unconstrained development, according to its own inherent nature, was something that social roles, however well designed, however lofty their justification, could not accommodate without damage. A horse in its natural state moves across the plains, eats grass, drinks from rivers, turns its coat against the wind. This is what a horse is, in its own terms, before anything is required of it. A horse trainer who arrives with a bridle fashioned according to a precise ideal of what a properly controlled horse should look like, who shoes the hooves and brands the hide, and teaches the animal to respond correctly to particular commands, has not improved the horse. He has bent it to a different purpose. Some horses do not survive the bending. Those that do are no longer quite the thing they were. This image, which appears in the text attributed to Zhuangzi, was not a mild critique of training methods. It was a way of thinking about what Confucianism was doing to human beings. Confucianism, the dominant philosophical tradition of the era, and the one most actively courted by rulers who wanted a coherent theory of governance, held that human flourishing depended on the correct fulfillment of hierarchical social roles. To be a son was to behave as a son ought to behave toward a father, which was specified by ritual. To be a minister was to behave as a minister ought to behave toward a ruler, which was also specified by ritual. To be a ruler was to govern in ways that the ancient sages had determined were correct, which was also in its turn specified by ritual. The whole system depended on a prior agreement that the roles themselves were natural, that fitting oneself to them was not a constraint, but a completion, that the person who fulfilled his role with perfect ritual propriety was not a horse and a bridle, but a human being at his fullest expression. Zhuangzi disagreed, not loudly, not through systematic refutation, not with the kind of point-by-point argumentation that Mencius deployed when confronting opponents. He disagreed through stories, through animals, through dreams, through the image of a cook whose knife never dulls, because it never encounters the things that would dull it. He disagreed the way water disagrees with a dam, not by attacking the structure directly, but by finding, over time, the places where the structure is not quite complete. The state of Meng, where Zhuangzi lived his working life, was not one of the major powers. It was not the kind of place that attracted the most ambitious philosophers or the most consequential political decisions. In some accounts, it is described as a small territory within the larger sphere of influence of the state of Song. Whatever its precise borders and political status, it was a place from which a man of genuine intellectual gifts would have had reason, in that era, to seek advancement elsewhere. The philosophers who moved between courts were not merely careerists. Many of them genuinely believed that finding the right ruler, a ruler willing to actually implement a coherent philosophical program, was the only way to address the suffering produced by constant warfare and political instability. To remain in a minor position, to manage a lacquer garden and decline the invitation to something larger, was to make a choice that other serious thinkers of the era would have found difficult to understand. Whether any of them asked Zhuangzi about it directly, the texts do not record. What the texts do record is that the question seems to have been present in the philosophy itself, the question of why a person would choose to remain small when largeness was on offer, and what that choice implied about the nature of the offer. Within his lifetime, the state in which Zhuangzi lived changed its ruling house more than once. This was not unusual. The Warring States period produced a kind of architectural impermanence in political life, alliances forming and dissolving, ruling families rising to brief dominance before being absorbed or erased by larger powers, the banners above the city gates changing while the gates themselves remained. There is a particular experience available to someone who lives through multiple such changes, who watches the new symbols go up over the old structures, who observes that the new rulers court philosophers make arguments from the same general toolkit as the old rulers court philosophers, differing mainly in the conclusion drawn. The experience is something like watching an argument and realizing that the argument itself may be the problem, that the parties are so absorbed in the specific terms of their disagreement that neither has noticed how much they agree about the frame. Zhuangzi noticed the frame. More precisely, he made his philosophy out of noticing it. The competing schools of thought that surrounded him were, in his reading, all committed to the same fundamental error. They all assumed that the correct way to live could be specified in advance, formulated as a doctrine, transmitted as teaching, and applied to particular situations through the proper exercise of judgment, trained by that doctrine. Confucians and Mohists disagreed profoundly on what the specification should contain, but they agreed that there was a specification, that it could be known, and that the task of philosophy was to discover and transmit it. Zhuangzi's position was that this very assumption was the bridle, the idealized form imposed on the animal before the animal had been allowed to show its own nature. The tradition that Zhuangzi is most closely associated with reaches back to a text called the Tao Te Ching, attributed to a figure known as Laozi, whose dates and even existence are subjects of ongoing scholarly debate. The Tao Te Ching is a short book, 81 brief chapters, compressed into a style of aphoristic paradox that has been generating commentary and disagreement for more than 2 millennia. It concerns itself with governance as much as with philosophy, offering a vision of rule so light, so non-coercive, so attuned to the natural movement of things that those who are governed do not experience themselves as governed at all. Laozi and Zhuangzi are paired together under the name Lao-Zhuang philosophy, and there are genuine continuities between them. Both are skeptical of conventional human hierarchies. Both point toward a ground of reality that exceeds and precedes all linguistic categories. Both use paradox as a philosophical instrument rather than a failure of clarity. But the differences are real and worth holding alongside the similarities. The Tao Te Ching is compressed. Its 81 chapters move through their subject with the brevity of a man who believes that saying less brings one closer to what cannot be said. Its concerns are, at least partly, practical: how a ruler should govern, how a sage should move through the world, how the person who grasps the Tao should comport themselves in ordinary life. Zhuangzi's text is something else. It is discursive, expansive, digressive, and deeply strange. It contains stories about cooks and carpenters and fishermen and hermits and emperors and gods. It contains dialogues in which abstract principles are personified and sent to argue with each other. It contains parables whose moral, if there is a moral, hides somewhere in the middle and refuses to resolve into the ending. It contains passages of such concentrated philosophical density that scholars have spent careers on a single paragraph, and passages of such lightness that they read as if the philosophy has dissolved into pure delight at the existence of things. The text that carries his name is complicated by questions of authorship. Scholars who have studied the 33 chapters of the Zhuangzi have reached a general consensus that only the 7 chapters, known as the inner chapters, can be attributed with reasonable confidence to Zhuangzi himself. The remaining chapters, the outer chapters and the miscellaneous chapters, are understood to have been composed by disciples, editors, and other thinkers of varying philosophical orientations who were working within or adjacent to the tradition that Zhuangzi's own writing had established. This is not unusual for ancient texts. It reflects the way intellectual traditions developed and were transmitted across generations, the original voice-gathering commentary and elaboration until the edges between the original and the response became difficult to locate. The inner chapters, at any rate, contain the butterfly dream and contain the passages most completely representative of the voice that later generations would treat as Zhuangzi's own. That voice had a quality that set it apart even from the rich philosophical landscape of its era. It was willing to be uncertain, not as a rhetorical strategy, not as a feigned humility designed to disarm opponents, but as a genuine philosophical position, the view that the questions were hard enough and the perspective of any individual or school limited enough, that confident assertions about the correct way to organize human life were always somewhat suspect. In a period when philosophers were arriving at courts with confident programs for reorganizing society, this was a minority position. It was also, in the judgment of many later readers, an unusually honest one. After Zhuangzi's death, his text survived. This is not as simple a fact as it sounds. The Warring States period ended with the violent unification of China under the Qin dynasty, whose first emperor instituted a policy that included the burning of books from rival philosophical schools and the killing of scholars who persisted in teaching from them. Daoism was not exempt from the pressures of that period. The survival of the Zhuangzi through the Qin and into the Han dynasty that followed it is a matter of historical contingency rather than any protection afforded by official favor. The text continued to be copied, to be read, to be passed between people who found something in it that addressed their condition, the condition of living in a world that kept rearranging itself, that kept disappointing the theories constructed to explain and improve it, that kept producing the particular kind of suffering that comes from forcing living things into shapes that do not match their nature. The moment often cited to illustrate the reach of that appeal comes from what historians call the Wei Jin period, roughly the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, a time of renewed political fragmentation following the collapse of the Han dynasty. Aristocrats of that era, many of them educated in the Confucian tradition, trained in the expectations of official service, watching yet another political order disintegrate, found in the Zhuangzi a text that seemed to have been written for exactly their moment. They called their practice of reading it, of discussing it, of living according to its general orientation, pure conversation, a kind of philosophical gathering in which the pretensions of political life could be set aside and replaced by something quieter and more honest. They were not the first readers to find this in Zhuangzi, and they would not be the last. What they found was a philosophy that had emerged from instability without being destabilized by it. This is the aspect of Zhuangzi's biography that becomes visible only against its proper historical background. He lived in a time of genuine violence and political horror. The Warring States period produced casualties at a scale that would not be equaled in Chinese history until much later, and his response to that violence was not to ignore it, not to transcend it through spiritual indifference, but to look at it carefully enough to locate the philosophical error that was producing it. The error was the assumption that the correct arrangement of human beings could be imposed from without, that nature could be shaped to doctrine rather than doctrine shaped to nature, that the horse in the bridle was more fully a horse than the horse at the river. From that error, everything else followed: the wars over territory and succession, the philosophers competing for the ears of rulers, the arguments about which set of ritual obligations would produce the most stable and prosperous state. Zhuangzi's alternative was not a competing political program. It was a reorientation of the question. Before asking how to order society correctly, he asked what a living being actually was when no order was being imposed upon it, what it moved toward naturally, what it did when not required to be useful, what it knew before it had been taught anything. In the lacquer garden, and this is the image with which this account can most honestly rest, there would have been ordinary sounds. The wind moving through the trees in a way that had nothing to do with any theory of governance or social hierarchy. The movement of insects going about the work of their own lives, with no awareness of the philosophical arguments being conducted among the larger beings nearby. The smell of the lacquer itself, sharp and particular, the smell of a specific material thing in a specific place at a specific time of day. A young man working in that garden, before he had written anything, before any messenger had arrived with any offer, would already have been in the presence of everything that his philosophy would eventually work to describe: the small, the particular, the natural, the unconstrained. Not an escape from the world, but a way of paying attention to a part of it that the arguments consuming his contemporaries had been consistently failing to account for. To stay there, to choose the lacquer garden over the court, the river over the ministerial hall, the tail in the mud over the silk wrapping in the ancestral shrine, was already an argument, not yet formulated into the stories and paradoxes that would eventually form the inner chapters, not yet refined into the compressed and brilliant passages that would survive 2,500 years of copying and commentary and political upheaval, but present in its essential shape in the simple act of a young man in a garden choosing to remain there rather than leave it for something that the world of his era was calling more important. The wind came through the lacquer trees. The leaves moved in the way that leaves move, without instruction, without theory, without any ambition to be exemplary. A person standing among them, listening, might have noticed something that was very difficult to put into words, and that all the words being assembled by the rival schools of thought nearby were, in some important respect, failing to touch. Not because the words were bad words, or the arguments careless arguments, but because the thing itself, the quality of the afternoon, the specific texture of a mind that was not performing anything for anyone, was genuinely prior to all of them and seemed to know it. It would take years to find language for what had been noticed in that garden. The language, when it came, would be strange by the standards of its time, full of animals and dreamers and cooks who moved like water, full of questions that declined to resolve into answers, full of a lightness that philosophers trained in the Confucian and Mohist traditions sometimes mistook for frivolity before they read more carefully. The strangeness was not an accident. It was a considered decision to find a form that matched the content, a form as supple and non-coercive as the philosophy it was carrying. The messenger, on the day the high appointment was declined, would have turned and walked back toward the city with the answer Zhuangzi had given him, which was probably brief. The sounds of the garden would have returned to what they had been before the interruption. The lacquer trees stood in the late afternoon light, doing what they did, which required no justification and produced no argument, and was, in its own terms, entirely sufficient. At the end of a long chapter, Zhuangzi set down what he had been composing and wrote the butterfly passage last. This is worth holding for a moment, that the dream did not arrive as an illustration of something else, did not appear early in the argument as a way of warming the reader toward a conclusion. It came at the close. It was the final gesture. Whatever reasoning had preceded it, the butterfly was where the chapter rested, and the resting place Zhuangzi chose was not an answer, but a question, so quietly formed that it takes a second reading to feel how open it actually is. The chapter is called the Qiwalun, sometimes translated as on the equalization of things, sometimes as on the leveling of discussions, the Chinese character for equalization carrying within it the sense not of making things the same, but of noticing that the distinctions we draw between things are always drawn from somewhere, always the work of a perspective, never the view from above all views at once. Zhuangzi had spent the whole chapter pressing this point from different angles, the way a mind asleep to its own assumptions categorizes the world, the way right and wrong shift depending on who is standing where, the way the noise of human opinion fills the air so completely that the silence beneath it becomes almost impossible to hear. And then, at the end, he placed the dream. He had been a butterfly. The description is spare. He was a butterfly, fluttering, happy with himself, doing what butterflies do. And in that state, there was no awareness of being Zhuangzi, not a suppressed awareness, not a background hum of human identity waiting to reassert itself. There was simply no Zhuangzi present. The butterfly was complete, entirely what it was, with nothing left over. Then came the waking, suddenly, as the text has it, though the suddenness itself is part of what is being observed, the abrupt shift from one state to another, the way one configuration of experience gives way entirely to the next without negotiation. And here was Zhuangzi again, the man, the philosopher, the one who thinks about these things. And the question that followed the waking was not asked in alarm, not posed with the urgency of someone who has lost something. It was asked the way a person turns a smooth stone over in their hands, finding a different surface each time without expecting to arrive at the final surface, the one that settles the matter. Was he Zhuangzi, who had been dreaming of a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming of being Zhuangzi? The question has the quality of something that looks simple from a distance and becomes stranger the longer one stays with it. On first encounter, it can seem like a riddle, the kind of thing a philosopher says to show that ordinary certainty is shakier than it appears. But that is not quite the register it occupies. It is not a challenge. It does not arrive with the force of something trying to unsettle. It arrives the way a thought arrives in the last moments before sleep, when the mind is still moving, but more slowly, when the categories that organize waking experience have begun to soften at their edges without yet dissolving entirely. The question is shaped exactly like that kind of thought. It has the texture of the threshold. What makes the butterfly dream philosophically serious, rather than merely clever, is what it implies about the nature of perspective from within any given state of experience. While Zhuangzi was the butterfly's experience was complete. There was no sense of insufficiency, no sense that something important had been left behind. The butterfly did not feel like a partial or diminished form of being. It was entire, within its own terms, self-sufficient in exactly the way experience always feels self-sufficient from inside it. And this is the point that the dream turns on slowly, like light changing direction. From inside any state of consciousness, any perspective, any configuration of experience, that state presents itself as real, not probably real, not real pending further investigation, simply real, the way the ground beneath the feet is simply there, not requiring justification. The problem the dream exposes is that this sense of immediate, undeniable reality is available equally from inside the dreaming state and inside the waking one. The dreaming butterfly is not aware that it is dreaming. It is not aware of anything beyond what the butterfly state makes available. And when Zhuangzi wakes, the waking state presents itself with the same quality of simple, immediate reality that the dream had presented. There is no additional signal, no mark or watermark that distinguishes waking from dreaming from inside the experience of either. Philosophers call this the problem of the criterion, the difficulty of identifying the correct test for equality, when every available test is itself subject to the same question. From inside the waking state, waking feels real, but the feeling of reality was equally present in the dream. The two states cannot be distinguished, using only the tools that are available from within one of them. Any criterion one could propose for determining that the waking state is genuinely waking would have to be evaluated using the faculties of the waking state, which is exactly what is in question. The question does not resolve itself. It keeps its shape. Zhuangzi knew this. He had placed the question at the close of a chapter, arguing that distinctions are made from standpoints, and that no standpoint has access to the ground of all standpoints. The butterfly dream was not an anomaly at the end of that argument. It was the argument arriving in its most concentrated, most livable form, condensed into an image rather than a proposition, so that the reader could feel it, rather than merely follow it. There is another passage in the same chapter that approaches the same territory from a different direction, and it is worth following it a little way. Zhuangzi observes that those who dream of drinking wine may wake and weep. Those who dream of weeping may wake and go out to hunt. In the dream, the drinking felt like celebration. In the dream, the weeping felt like grief, genuine, unmistakable grief, the kind that is felt in the body, that changes the quality of everything around it. And then the state shifts, and the hunter is in the field, and the grief that had felt absolute is not there, not repressed, not set aside, simply gone because it belonged to a configuration of experience that no longer obtains. The emotional conviction that accompanies a dream is not a pale or weakened version of the emotional conviction of waking life. It is structurally indistinguishable from it while it is occurring. This is not, in Zhuangzi's telling, a reason for despair. The point is not that emotions are untrustworthy or that experience is fundamentally deceptive. The point is quieter and in some ways more unsettling in its quietness, that the certainty we bring to our current state, whatever state we are in, is always the certainty of that state, generated from within it, available only to the perspective that is already inside it. And this applies equally to the person reading the asterisk QLN asterisk in full daylight, entirely confident that they are awake, as it does to Zhuangzi asleep in the butterfly. The word Zhuangzi uses immediately after posing the dream question is asterisk huio asterisk, the transformation of things. He does not use it as an answer. He does not say, therefore, the explanation for this puzzle is transformation, and here is how transformation resolves the question of which state is real. He places the word there the way a calligrapher places the final stroke of a character, not to close the form, but to let it open into the space of the page. The transformation of things is not a solution to the problem of dreaming and waking. It is a loosening of the assumption that the problem requires a solution of the ordinary kind, the kind that settles the question by identifying one answer as correct and setting the other aside. In classical Chinese calligraphy, each stroke of the brush is itself a transformation, the wet ink on the page drying into form, the form already becoming part of a larger character, the character already in relation with the ones around it, none of them complete until the page is read, and none of them final. Even then, the word asterisk huahu, asterisk on the page, is made of strokes that do not arrive at a fixed point. They continue into the next character, the next breath of the writing, the next reader who picks up the text 2 centuries later in a different city with a different name. This is something like what Zhuangzi seems to mean by the transformation of things, not a doctrine about metaphysical change, but a way of holding the question that allows the question to remain open without that openness becoming distressing. The butterfly dream poses the question of identity across states of consciousness, and the transformation of things suggests that the answer is not located in fixing one state as the real one and the other as its shadow. Both the man and the butterfly are real within the terms of the state in which they appear. Both are transformations. Between them is not a hierarchy of realness, but a threshold, a moment of passage, a place where one configuration gives way to another without either being diminished. That threshold is where the philosophy lives. The scholars who have spent time with this passage tend to agree that the liminal moment, the space between butterfly and man, between sleeping and waking, between one configuration of experience and the next, is where Zhuangzi is most interested in standing, not in the butterfly state, which is complete in itself, and not in the waking state, which is also complete in itself, but in the passage between them, because it is precisely there, in the passage, that the constructed quality of both identities becomes visible. When the dream is fully present, Zhuangzi is entirely the butterfly, and there is no awareness of construction. When waking is fully present, he is entirely the man, and again there is no awareness of construction. But in the transition, in that brief moment when the architecture of one state has not yet dissolved, and the certainty of the other has not yet settled, something else is briefly present, a recognition that both states are made, shaped, assumed, entered, and exited. Sleep moves through that threshold every night. The passage from waking into dreaming is not a sharp line, but a gradual softening, a slow dissolution of the categories that organize the waking day, the names and plans, and roles and evaluations, and then the dream state assembles itself from different materials, or from the same materials arranged differently, and for a time, that new arrangement is simply the world, complete and unquestioned. The passage from dream to waking reverses this. The dream architecture loses resolution, something else begins to reassemble, and for a moment, both are present simultaneously. The residue of the dream still felt in the body, the waking self not yet fully gathered into its familiar form. That moment is not frightening in Zhuangzi's telling. It is not presented as a gap or a failure or a loss. It is presented as a threshold, and thresholds in Daoist thinking are not dangers to be crossed quickly. They are places where the ordinary categories have thinned enough that something else can be noticed, something that the full solidity of either state would make invisible. There is a certain quality of light in the earliest part of the night, when the boundary between thought and image has just begun to soften, A person lying down who notices this, not trying to hold on to waking, not trying to accelerate into sleep, but simply present to the passage, is already, in a small way, in the neighborhood of what Zhuangzi was describing. The ideas that surface in that condition have a different texture from thoughts. They are more like shapes. They turn in the mind without effort, presenting different surfaces, not requiring anything from the one who holds them. The butterfly dream has exactly that texture. It is not an argument that asks to be followed step by step. It is a shape. Man dreaming of butterfly, or butterfly dreaming of man, held in the mind, not as a problem waiting for a solution, but as something that can be turned slowly. The way a question feels different at 2 in the afternoon than it does at the edge of sleep. The afternoon version sharp and demanding, the late night version simply present, asking nothing, resting in the mind with a quality that is almost like companionship. What Zhuangzi had been composing in the Kewaloon was an argument that all perspectives are partial, and that the ground from which distinctions are drawn is always a particular ground, never the universal one. The butterfly dream arrives at the close of this as its most intimate expression, not a demonstration of a general philosophical point, but a personal account of a specific experience that enacts the point from the inside. Zhuangzi does not say, consider the possibility that waking and dreaming might not be clearly distinguishable. He says, last night I was a butterfly, and when I woke, I did not know which of the two I was. The philosophy is inside the experience, not standing beside it explaining it. This is one of the qualities that distinguishes the asterisk Zhuangzi, asterisk from most philosophical writing, in any tradition. The arguments are never fully separable from the experience of reading them. The butterfly dream is not more clearly understood as a proposition than it is as an image. The image and the argument are the same thing, in the way that a certain quality of silence is both something heard and something that means something, the two not separate. The Kewaloon had argued in the passages before the butterfly dream that the great arguments between philosophers, between those who say this is right and those who say this is wrong, between those who find beauty here and those who find it there, are all conducted from standpoints, and that no standpoint has the authority to settle the question for all other standpoints. The sage, in Zhuangzi's account, does not achieve certainty about which standpoint is correct. The sage rests in the transformation of things. The sage holds the standpoints lightly, aware that each is a view from somewhere rather than a view from everywhere, and in that lightness finds something that is not uncertainty, and not certainty, but something more supple than either. The butterfly that did not know it was Zhuangzi was resting in the transformation of things. It was not troubled by the question of whether its perspective was partial. It was simply complete within its own terms, moving through open air with no weight of accumulated identity pressing down on it, no awareness of being anything other than exactly what it was in that moment. When Zhuangzi woke and posed his question, he was doing something different. He was standing briefly at the threshold, holding both states in mind at once, and in that doubling noticing something about the structure of experience that the fully settled waking state would have concealed. There is something generous in how Zhuangzi posed the question. He did not say, I have discovered that waking is uncertain, that the ground beneath our confident daylight experience is less solid than we supposed, that the self we take ourselves to be is not what we think it is. He said, I was a butterfly, and then I was a man who had been a butterfly, and I am not sure now which one is doing the dreaming. This is a philosopher working in an entirely different key from the one that announces discoveries and overturns assumptions. The butterfly dream does not announce. It places. It puts a shape in the mind and leaves it there, turning slowly and the turning is the thought. Zhuangzi followed the dream passage with asterisk hua, huoyo asterisk, the transformation of things, and then the chapter closed. The reader who has followed the whole Guwulun arrives at those final lines, having been asked across the chapter to loosen their hold on the view from nowhere, the fantasy that one's own perspective is not a perspective, but simply the way things are. The butterfly dream is the loosening, made personal and felt, not a doctrine, not a conclusion, but a moment of actual uncertainty, honestly reported, followed by the name for what that uncertainty opens into: transformation. What the dream opens is not confusion. Confusion is distressing because it implies that clarity was available and has been lost. What the butterfly dream opens is something quieter: the recognition that clarity, of the kind that settles the question of which state is real, was perhaps never the appropriate expectation. The man and the butterfly are both complete. The threshold between them is real. The transformation continues. This is not the resolution of a problem. It is the discovery that the problem was held inside an assumption that one of the two states must be the real one, and that releasing the assumption does not leave nothing in its place. It leaves the transformation of things, which is a different kind of ground, softer, continuous, less available to the daylight mind, but not absent. The passage from waking to sleep is itself a form of asterisk hua, asterisk a transformation, not a passage from one real state into one less real, not a departure from the waking world into something that merely resembles it. A transformation, one configuration of experience giving way to another, each complete within itself, the threshold between them being the place where, for a brief moment, neither one has closed around the one who is crossing. There is a kind of not knowing that is not ignorance. Ignorance is the absence of information that was available and was simply not acquired. This other kind of not knowing is what remains when the usual tools for establishing certainty have been applied honestly and have met an edge they cannot get past. Zhuangzi applied the question as honestly as possible: was he the man or the butterfly? And found that he could not answer it from inside either state, using only what that state made available. The not knowing that followed was not a failure. It had the quality of something that opens rather than closes. The listener who arrives at this passage in the earliest part of the night, lying in the dark, with the waking world beginning to thin, and the other state beginning to assemble itself at the edges of consciousness, is already very close to the threshold Zhuangzi described. The categories of the day, the names of things, the plans, the judgments, the sense of a continuous self that has a past and is pointed toward a future, these are beginning, quietly, to loosen their hold, not to disappear, not yet, but to become less urgent, less fixed. The furniture of the waking mind is still there, but it has begun to feel less like the furniture of the only room. Jinji placed the butterfly at the close of his chapter rather than the beginning, because the dream is not an entry point into the philosophical question. It is where the philosophical question finally arrives, after enough preliminary loosening, at the form that allows it to be felt rather than merely understood. The chapter had done its work. The held certainties had been gently, patiently, and without urgency examined. And then at the end came the butterfly, not as a conclusion, not as proof of anything, but as a resting place that is also an opening. Not knowing which side of the threshold one is on is not a failure of understanding. It may be that understanding of the ordinary, daylight kind, the kind that settles a question by identifying the correct answer and setting the others aside, is not what this question requires or rewards. The question has a different relationship to understanding. It asks to be held rather than solved, turned rather than answered, rested with rather than resolved. And so the chapter closed where it had always been heading, not toward a solution, but toward the still and open condition of a mind that has sat long enough with a question that the urgency drains out of it, and only the question remains, shaped like a butterfly, shaped like a threshold, shaped like the particular quality of the air in the moment between one state and the next, before anything has settled, before anything has been decided, before the waking self has fully returned, or the dream has entirely let go. That pause, brief, unrepeatable, softer than either of the states it holds between, is where Zhuangzi left the reader, not on one side or the other, on the threshold itself, which is not a place but a passage, and not a passage but a transformation, and not a transformation that moves between two fixed points, but one that simply continues, the way things continue, quietly and without announcement, into whatever comes next. In a candlelit room in early imperial China, a reader sets the scroll open across his knees and reads the first line of the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk aloud. The words arrive, and then they stop him, not because they are difficult in the way a legal argument is difficult, or dense in the way a mathematical proof is dense, but because the first line announces, before anything else can be said, that whatever follows cannot be the thing it is pointing at. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. He reads it again. The candle does not move. Outside, the city goes on as cities do, with its markets and its arguments and its passing carts, and inside this room, a man sits with a text that has just told him, in its opening breath, that language cannot carry it, and then continued speaking anyway. This is where Daoist philosophy begins. Not with a doctrine, not with an injunction toward virtue, or a map of correct social conduct. It begins with an act of philosophical honesty, so complete that it folds back on itself. The ground of all things cannot be spoken, and so here is a book. The paradox is not a flaw in the asterisk Tao Te Ching, asterisk, it is the teaching. The first line does not introduce the subject and then proceed to explain it. The first line performs the limit of explanation, and then everything that follows is written inside that acknowledged limit, not claiming to capture the Tao, but pointing, the way a finger points, in a direction where the Tao might be felt, if the looking is of the right kind. What kind of looking is that? The reader in the candlelit room has been trained in the careful, precise looking of Confucian scholarship, the close reading of texts, the explication of ritual, the alignment of behavior with hierarchical duty. That is a looking that seeks to determine what is correct and to establish it firmly. The looking the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk requires is something else, something more like the looking one does at a river moving at night, when the detail is gone and only the shape of the motion remains. Not a looking that produces conclusions, a looking that produces openness. The word the Daoists reach for again and again, when they are trying to name this openness, is one that does not translate easily. Jew, it is usually rendered as emptiness, or vacancy, or void, but each of those English words carries a slight flavor of deficiency, as though something were missing, as though the space had once been full and had lost whatever occupied it. Jew is not that. Zhuangzi is the kind of empty that makes something possible that would be impossible if the space were occupied. The asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk offers 3 images for this, placed together in a single short passage, so the reader can feel them accumulating. A wheel turns on its axle. The hub of the wheel is hollow. It is the hollow that permits the turning. Fill the hub with wood, and the wheel is a solid disc, which is heavier and does not turn. A clay pot is useful because of the space inside it. Press the clay inward until it is solid, and what remains is a lump, not a vessel. The rooms of a house are useful because they are empty. Build the walls without building the space between them, and what remains is rubble, not shelter. The images are so plain, they nearly vanish on contact, but held together, they are saying something that would have unsettled the reader in that candlelit room, the same way the first line unsettled him. They are saying that the productive reality of a thing is not its substance, but its absence. Not the wood of the wheel, but the space at the center of the wood. Not the clay of the pot, but the air the clay surrounds. This is not a poetic observation about hollowness. It is a cosmological claim. The ground of things is not a thing. The Tao that underlies all particular existence is not itself a particular existent. It is the shu, the generative emptiness from which things arise and into which they return, and it is precisely because it is not a thing that it can be the ground of all things. The way the hollow at the hub is precisely because it is nothing that it can be the turning point of everything. The reader closes his eyes for a moment. The candle continues. Outside, the cart goes on. The city does not pause, and inside this room, inside this man, something has shifted very slightly. Not a conclusion reached, but a question genuinely opened, which is a different kind of event entirely. Laozi's text circles this emptiness with its compressed aphorisms and its quiet paradoxes. Zhuangzi approaches the same ground from a different angle, with longer reach and less compression, through stories and dialogues and parables that are sometimes comic and sometimes elegiac and sometimes both at once. Where Laozi points with short, hard lines, Zhuangzi unfolds. Where Laozi states the paradox and stops, Zhuangzi lets a character live inside it for a while and see how it feels. The two texts come from the same philosophical source, but they move through it differently. The asterisk Dao Te Ching, asterisk like a stone dropped into still water, and the asterisk Zhuangzi, asterisk like watching the rings spread. One of the most illuminating of Zhuangzi's parables concerns a cook named Ding, and it concerns him at the moment when his work is finished. Prince Hui has just watched Cook Ding break down an entire ox. He watched the cook's hands, the movement of his shoulders, the way his feet were placed and his knee pressed. He heard the sound. What he heard was not the harsh, scraping sound of bone meeting blade. What he heard was something closer to music, the movement of a saw through old timber, the sound of a chord struck on a lute, which is to say, a sound that had rhythm and agreement built into it, a sound that did not fight the space it moved through, but arrived inside it as though invited. Prince Hui says wonderful. The way the skill is applied, wonderful. Cook Ding sets down the knife, and his answer is not what a person expecting praise for skill would give. He does not claim mastery. He does not explain his technique. He says that what he follows is the Tao, which is beyond mere technique. He says that when he first began, he saw only the whole ox. After 3 years, he no longer saw the whole ox. Now he works with his mind and not with his eye, moving through the natural spaces and cavities that the animal's anatomy has already made available, following the great joints and the main cavities and the natural constitution of the thing. He has never cut through a joint. He has certainly never hacked at bone. A good cook, he says, changes his knife once a year because he cuts. A poor cook changes it once a month because he hacks. His own knife is 19 years old, and its blade is still as sharp as the day it came from the grindstone, because it has spent 19 years finding the spaces that were already there, passing through the places where no resistance lives. Prince Hui watches the cook wipe the knife and set it carefully aside, and says, "I have heard the words of Cook Ding and learned from them how to nurture life." The prince understands that this is not a lesson in butchery. It is a lesson in how to move through whatever presents itself, the situation, the day, the material of one's own life, not by imposing force upon it, but by becoming sufficiently attentive to its natural structure that the movement one makes inside it requires no force at all. This is what the Daoists call wu-wei. The phrase is sometimes translated as non-action, and sometimes as effortless action, and sometimes, most carefully, as action that does not contend. None of these translations are wrong, and none of them are quite right, because the concept they are reaching for is not the absence of doing, but the doing that leaves no residue of struggle. Cook Ding does not stop cutting the ox. He does not stand aside while some other force cuts it. He cuts it, and what makes his cutting different from the poor cook's hacking is not a different quantity of action, but a different quality of presence. The poor cook imposes. Cook Ding attends. The poor cook meets resistance because he approaches the material with a fixed idea of how the blade should move. Cook Ding meets no resistance because he approaches with a blade and an attention so complete that the blade finds its own path. Wu-wei is not stillness, though stillness can produce it. It is not passivity, though it looks like ease. It is the action of a thing moving in full accordance with its own nature, and with the nature of what it meets, the way water moves downhill, not because it has decided to go downhill and applied effort toward that goal, but because going downhill is what water does when nothing opposes its own nature. The river at night, moving through an unfamiliar landscape, does not pause to deliberate. It finds the lowest available ground and moves toward it with the whole of itself, unhurried and without doubt. This is not mechanical. The Taoists would not call it mechanical. They would call it ziran, self-sonus, which is a word for the quality of things that arise and move according to their own inherent nature, without external compulsion and without internal conflict. Ziran is both description and aspiration in Taoist thinking. As a description, it names the way the Tao operates, not by decree or intention or design, but by a kind of spontaneous self-organization that is too complete to require any force applied from outside. As an aspiration, it points toward a way of human life in which the constant management and adjustment and social performance that ordinary life requires is gradually replaced by something quieter and more native, a way of being in which a person is not perpetually correcting towards some external standard of correctness, but moving, like Cook Ding's blade, through the spaces that their own nature and the world's nature have already made. The butterfly in the dream, the one Zhuangzi writes about in the chapter called the Kuo Lun, does not try to be a butterfly. It is not performing butterflyness, and it is not straining towards some ideal of what a butterfly should be. It is moving through the air with no awareness of weight, no awareness of having a name, no awareness of anything except the immediate fact of moving, and this unself-conscious completeness is what the passage is quietly pointing at. The butterfly is a creature of pure ziran. It does not reflect on its own motion. It does not compare its flight to other flights and find itself adequate or deficient. The flight is the thing, without remainder, and because nothing is subtracted from it by self-observation or self-correction, it is as complete as anything can be. When Zhuangzi wakes and asks his question, was he a man dreaming of a butterfly, nor is he now a butterfly dreaming of a man? Part of what the question is holding is the contrast between the butterfly's unself-conscious completeness and the man's immediate return to the apparatus of self-awareness. The man wakes and asks a philosophical question. The butterfly would never, and this is not because the butterfly is inferior. The chapter from which the butterfly dream comes is titled in classical Chinese, Chui Wa Lun, on the equalization of things. The central argument of that chapter is one that requires sitting with rather than summarizing, because its point is precisely that summary, the kind that requires one perspective to stand over the others and declare them equal is impossible. The argument runs something like this. Every distinction we make between things, this is right, that is wrong, this is beautiful, that is ugly, this is large, that is small, is made from a particular standpoint. The cicada laughing at the great bird's flight because the cicada cannot imagine why anything would want to travel so far. The cicada is not wrong from the cicada's standpoint. The mushroom of a morning that does not know the alternation of day and night is not ignorant within its own span. The world is entire. Every perspective is complete within its own terms. Every perspective is also limited by its own terms. And there is no perspective from nowhere, no view outside all views, from which the correct set of distinctions could be identified as universally valid and the others dismissed as errors. Scholars who study this position give it a careful name to distinguish it from something it is easy to mistake it for. They call it perspectivism, and they distinguish it from simple relativism. Relativism, in its most common form, says that all views are equally valid, which is itself a view claiming validity, and so eats its own foundation immediately. Zhuangzi's perspectivism does not say all views are equally valid. It says that the move of claiming one view is universally superior to all others requires a standpoint outside all views, and that such a standpoint is not available to any particular being, not to the philosopher who argues for it, not to the cicada, not to the great bird. What follows from this is not that all views are identical, but that the urgency of having the correct view, the view that supersedes all others, is itself a kind of philosophical overreach. The equalization of things is not the claim that things have no differences. It is the relinquishment of the conviction that there is one correct standpoint from which the differences can be weighed and settled once and for all. This is a position that is easy to describe and genuinely difficult to inhabit. The reader in the candlelit room would have understood the argument quickly and felt the resistance to it immediately, because to genuinely inhabit the Q-Alun position is to give up something that human thought tends to hold very tightly, the conviction that one is, at least in principle, capable of arriving at the view from which things are correctly seen. Confucian philosophy had given that conviction a particular form. The correct view was the view that aligned with ritual propriety, with the proper ordering of hierarchical relations, with the careful matching of conduct to role. The Confucian scholar who mastered these alignments could say, with confidence, what was right and what was wrong in a given situation. Zhuangzi's philosophy does not attack this directly. It does something harder to argue with. It asks where the Confucian scholar is standing when he makes those determinations, and it finds that he is standing on the ground of a particular tradition, from a particular historical moment, with a particular set of categories he did not choose, but inherited, and that from the standpoint of a different tradition, a different moment, different categories, different determinations, would emerge with equal confidence and equal internal consistency. The question the Q-Alun leaves open is not which tradition is correct, but what the concept of correctness is doing in a conversation about the Tao. Cookding's kitchen, after the work is finished, is very quiet. The tools have been wiped and returned to their places. The surfaces are clean. The cook himself has stepped back from the work and set the knife aside with care, not the care of someone who is thinking about the knife, but the care that comes from long habituation, from thousands of repetitions of the same motion, until the motion has become as natural and unconsidered as breathing. The prince has gone. The animal that was there is no longer there, or rather, it is there differently, arranged, transformed, its anatomy made visible by its dissolution. Nothing has been wasted, nothing has been forced. The blade passed through the spaces that were already there, and the work is done, and the kitchen is still. What Prince Hui said, that he had learned from the cook's words how to nurture life, is a phrase the commentators return to often, because nurturing life is not what one expects a lesson in butchery to produce. The prince does not say he has learned to be more efficient, or that he now understands the anatomy of an ox. He says he has learned something about life, about how to inhabit it without damaging it through the application of force to places that do not have room for force. This is what Wo Wei is in practice, not as a concept, but as a way of moving through the particular ox of one's own circumstances. Find the spaces, follow the natural cavities. Do not hack at bone. Emptiness in Daoist thought is generative. This is the move that many readers of the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk initially resist, because emptiness in ordinary usage is the absence of something desirable. An empty house is one where no one lives. An empty promise is one that will not be kept. An empty life is a failure of meaning. But the shoe that the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk is pointing at is not the emptiness of deprivation. It is the emptiness of the bowl, which is empty precisely so that it can be filled, can hold whatever arrives in it, can be of use. A bowl already full of itself is not a bowl anymore. A mind already full of its own conclusions about how things are is not, in the Taoist sense, a fully functioning mind. It has foreclosed the very kind of attending that Cook Ding's 19-year blade demonstrates, the attending that finds the spaces rather than forcing a passage. The student of philosophy sitting with the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk open to its first line, reading it again in the candlelit room, is practicing a kind of shoe without knowing it. By sitting with the paradox of the first line, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Rather than resolving it or setting it aside as nonsense, he is leaving a space in his thinking that is not empty in the deprivative sense, but empty in the generative sense, available, receptive, not yet foreclosed. The Tao will not fill that space with a doctrine. The Tao does not offer doctrines. What fills the space, slowly and gradually, is something closer to an orientation, a way of holding all the particular things of experience, lightly enough that their relation to each other becomes visible, the way the spaces in an ox become visible to a cook who is not forcing his blade. There is a quality of night in all of this. The Taoist texts seem to belong to the hours of decreased light, not because they are obscure, though they can be, but because they are addressed to a mode of knowing that is less active than the knowing of daylight. Daylight knowing makes determinations. It identifies and categorizes. It assigns things to their correct positions in a hierarchy of value. Night knowing moves differently. It is less insistent. It follows what presents itself rather than reaching for what it has decided to look for. The great bird's flight covers 90,000 li, and the cicada cannot imagine why, and the Kualoon makes room for both of them. The great bird in its arc, and the cicada in its incomprehension, without deciding that one of them has the better relationship to distance. Ziran. The word arrives in the texts not as a concept defined and then applied, but as a quality noticed and returned to, the quality of the river that finds its level without deliberation, of the seed that becomes what it is without consulting an ideal, of the butterfly in the dream that is utterly and completely itself without knowing what itself is. Self-soness, not self-consciousness, but self-accordance, the coincidence of a thing with its own nature, so complete that no gap opens between what a thing is and what it does. The gap that opens in human life between what a person is and what they are expected to perform, between the self in its natural movement and the self as shaped by social role and ritual obligation, is precisely what Zhuangzi's philosophy keeps noticing, the way a blade keeps noticing the bones it is navigating around. The philosophy does not say the gap is wrong or that it should be closed by effort. It suggests that the gap is what happens when Ziran is forgotten, and that remembering it is not a task to be accomplished, but a settling that occurs when the effort to maintain the gap is finally put down. A mind deliberately emptied of its habitual preferences and categories, sitting with an unfamiliar situation, will sometimes find that without the usual furniture of judgment, the situation reveals its own shape. This is not a mystical claim. It is a phenomenological observation, the kind that the Daoist texts make repeatedly, in image and story and parable, because the observation cannot be transferred by argument. An argument about emptiness leaves the mind full of the argument. A story about a cook whose blade is 19 years old and still sharp because it has spent 19 years finding the available space. That story does something different. It offers an image the mind can set inside itself and return to, the way a stone that has been kept in the hand for a long time takes on the warmth of the hand that held it. The river at night, moving through terrain it has not chosen, finds the lowest available ground by a process that is neither deliberate nor mechanical. And this is why Ziran is not the same as determinism, though it is easy to confuse them. Determinism says the river moves the way it moves because the prior causes compel it. Ziran says the river moves the way it moves because that is the river's nature, meeting the world's shape, and the meeting produces this movement, and this movement is the river being fully the river, without any gap between what it is and what it does. The distinction is philosophical, and it matters. Determinism is a framework imposed on the river from outside by an observer who wants to understand causation. Ziran is the river from the inside, which is to say the river without an inside and an outside, the river as the unbroken fact of its own flowing. Late in the Quelun, after the perspectives have been multiplied and the distinctions have been called into question, and the equalization of things has been approached from several angles, Zhuangzi writes about those who dream of drinking wine and weep when morning comes. He writes about those who dream of weeping and in the morning go out to hunt. He is pressing, quietly and without urgency, the point that the emotional conviction present during a dream is structurally indistinguishable from the emotional conviction present in waking life. They feel the same from the inside. The grief in the dream is grief. The relief of the hunt in the morning after grief is relief. Both states are complete within their own terms. Both feel entirely real to the one who inhabits them. The question of which one is more real does not arise from inside either of them, and from outside both. The question begins to soften into something less like a problem and more like a feature of the territory being the transformation of things. The hua that Zhuangzi places at the end of the butterfly passage as a word that does not resolve the question, but names the condition within which the question makes sense. Transformation, hua, not change in the sense of one stable state, replacing another stable state. Not the swap of one fixed identity for a different fixed identity. Transformation as the continuous movement through which things arise from and return to the ground of the Tao, each state real within its own terms, each state impermanent, each state not an error corrected by the next state, but a moment in the unbroken flow of things becoming what they are and then becoming other things. The mushroom of a morning does not fail to be a mushroom because it will be gone by nightfall. The chrysalis is not a failed caterpillar or a premature butterfly. Cook Ding's knife at the end of the 19th year is not the same knife it was at the beginning. It has passed through 19 years of meeting the world and has been changed by each of those meetings, and it is still, and precisely for that reason, whole. The student reading the asterisk Tao Te Ching, asterisk in the candlelit room, sets the scroll aside and sits for a while without reading. The candle has shortened. The city outside has grown quieter. There is a quality to the room now that was not present when he began, a quality that does not come from something added, but from something that was always there and has become more available as the evening has deepened and the light has softened. Shoo. He is not thinking about the concept. He is not working through its implications. He is sitting in the room, which is quiet, and the quiet is not empty in the bad sense, but empty in the sense the wheel's hub is empty, available, central, productive of everything that turns around it. This is not enlightenment in any dramatic sense. It is not the resolution of the paradox in the first line. The paradox in the first line has not been resolved and will not be. The Tao that can be spoken is still not the eternal Tao, and the book is still speaking, and the student is still reading it. What has shifted is the relationship to the paradox, from something to be gotten through to something to be inhabited, from a problem blocking the path to the quality of the path itself. Zhuangzi would recognize this shift. He would not say much about it. He would pick up the story of Cook Ding again, or return to the butterfly, or find another parable that approaches the same territory from a different angle, because the territory is inexhaustible and the approach is never final. And this is not a limitation, but the condition of all genuine thinking. Cook Ding's empty kitchen holds the residue of work done without residue. The tools are at rest. The surfaces are clean. The blade that has spent 19 years finding available space is returned to its place with the same quality of motion that moved it through the ox, not the motion of performance, not the motion of effort, but the motion of something moving in full accordance with its own nature. The cook is done for the evening. Whatever his thinking is now, it is not the thinking of someone reviewing what he did and assessing it. That assessment happened years ago and produced the understanding he demonstrated for the prince. What remains is quieter than assessment. It is the quality of a person who has done a thing so many times that the thing no longer separates from the doing of it, who is not a cook who knows how to butcher an ox, but something closer to the movement through the ox, the attention to its natural spaces, the blade arriving where no resistance lives. The highest skill in Daoist thought leaves no trace of effort. This is not because the effort was not real. Cook Ding's skill required 19 years of practice, 19 years of learning to attend rather than impose, 19 years of keeping the blade sharp by never using it against what it was not made to meet. The effort was real and long and patient. What disappeared was not the effort, but its visibility. The way a river that has been running for long enough in one landscape eventually moves with so little apparent force that it looks simply like water being where water goes, which is to say, everywhere that is lower than where it was, which is to say, everywhere that its nature and the world's shape have agreed that water should be. The effort disappears into the Zirin it was always working toward, and what remains is not emptiness in the deprivative sense, but the fullest possible kind of presence, a presence so complete it makes no sound. The way a very large, very quiet space announces itself through what it allows, through the range and clarity of everything that can be heard inside it. Huizi arrived at dusk, walking quickly, the way people walk when they are not sure what they will find. He had heard what happened. He had heard that Zhuangzi's wife was dead, and he had come because that is what a friend does, and because he did not know what else to do. What he found when he arrived was Zhuangzi sitting on the ground beside the body, his legs stretched out in front of him, his back easy against the wall, singing, not weeping, not sitting in formal stillness as the rites required, singing some low, formless thing, the way a person hums without knowing they are humming, the sound coming from somewhere below intention. Huizi stopped in the entrance. The room was quiet, except for that sound. He stood there long enough that the quietness began to have weight. Then he said what anyone would say in any age, watching a man sing beside the body of his wife. This is too much. This is beyond what is right. She lived with you. She raised your children. She grew old with you. And now you sit here singing. Zhuangzi looked up, and what was in his face was not the absence of grief, but something that had been on the other side of grief long enough to find its footing. He said that when she first died, he had not been unmoved. He had sat with the loss, and it had been present in him the way loss is present. But then he had thought further back, before she was alive, before she had a body, before she had a form at all. He had followed it all the way back to the beginning of whatever the beginning was, and what he found there was not loss. What he found was the great transformation, the continuous motion of which his wife and her life and her death were each a passing shape. She had moved through those shapes. She was moving still into whatever form came next, the way the seasons move, not ceasing but changing, not ending but continuing in a direction no grief could follow. He was not performing equanimity. That is the important thing to understand about this story. He had not trained himself into indifference or argued himself out of feeling. He had thought his way through to a place where the feeling and the philosophy were the same thing, where what he knew and what he felt had finally arrived at the same address. And that place was not cold. It was not even particularly still. It was more like the quality of a very large space where the usual furniture of suffering had not been removed, but had simply become difficult to locate. The self that suffers in Zhuangzi's understanding is not a fixed and permanent thing. It is a configuration. It is the way certain tendencies and patterns and accumulated habits of perception have gathered together into something that walks and speaks and carries a name and recognizes a face across a room. This gathering is real. Nothing about Zhuangzi's philosophy requires that it be dismissed as illusion, but it is not the only configuration available to whatever is doing the gathering. The butterfly in the dream was just as fully present to its own experience as the man who fell asleep to dream it. The butterfly did not carry the man's name, or the man's memories, or the man's social obligations. It carried nothing except the immediate fact of being a butterfly in open air, and that was enough. That was complete. What the butterfly dream does, considered from this angle, is not pose a puzzle about which identity is real. It does something quieter and more thoroughgoing. It suggests that the apparatus we use to maintain a self, the memories, the plans, the roles, the narratives of continuity, is something that can be, and every night is, set aside. And when it is set aside, experience does not stop. Something continues. The butterfly does not cease to be when the man's waking thoughts are absent. Whatever is present in the dream goes on being present, moving through the air, completely itself, needing nothing from the waking world to authorize its existence. This is what Zhuangzi means when he speaks of transformation, not that things disappear, but that they continue in forms the previous configuration could not have anticipated. His wife had not gone. She had moved into a shape he could not yet see. He was not yet in that shape himself, so there was, for now, distance. That distance was what he had sat with when she first died, and what had moved through him. By the time Huzi arrived, the distance had not closed. It had simply become part of the larger space in which he was sitting, and the singing was not defiance of the loss, but a way of being in the same room with it without requiring it to be other than what it was. The inner chapters of the Zhuangzi return to this again and again from different angles, the way a person walking around a large stone will look at it from every side without any single view being final. Zhuangzi writes of the mushroom that lives a single morning and does not know the alternation of day and night. He writes of a chrysalis that understands nothing of what it is becoming. He writes of a cicada that cannot comprehend the great bird's flight across the 90,000 live of open sky, not because the cicada is deficient, but because the cicada's world is complete within its own terms, and the great bird's world is complete within its own terms, and neither completeness is a diminishment of the other. What this implies about the self is not comfortable in the way that comfortable things are comfortable, not warm and familiar and predictable. It is comfortable the way a very large sky is comfortable after a long time spent in a low-ceilinged room. The self, it turns out, is not a container for experience. It is more like a temporary arrangement of experience, the way water in a bowl is still water, carrying everything that water carries, and the bowl is real, and the specific shape of the water in it is real, but the water is not committed to that bowl in any absolute way. The transformation of things includes the self. The self is not exempt. A student reading the Zhuangzi for the first time will often arrive at this idea with the immediate response that it must be frightening, that if the self is not fixed, something is lost, that if there is no stable identity persisting beneath all the configurations, then whatever a person has taken themselves to be is not as solid as it felt. This response is worth staying with because it points at something true. There is, in that first encounter with Zhuangzi's dissolution of the fixed self, a brief vertigo, the feeling of a floor that has been trustworthy suddenly becoming less certain underfoot. But Zhuangzi's own experience of this idea, as it shows up across the inner chapters, is nothing like vertigo. It is much closer to relief. The fixed self is not a gift. It is a considerable amount of work. It requires constant maintenance, the monitoring of how one is perceived, the enforcement of consistency between past commitments and present choices, the defense of one's position in the hierarchies of social life, the rehearsal of one's own story, often enough to keep it coherent. The mushroom of a morning does none of this. The butterfly in the dream does none of this. And in the doing of none of it, they are, in Zhuangzi's view, not impoverished, but something very close to free. There is a passage in the Zhuangzi, in the story of Cook Ding, that approaches this from a different direction. Prince Hui watches his cook butcher an ox, and what he sees is not what he expected to see. He expected skill. He expected the practiced efficiency of a craftsman who has done this many thousands of times. What he saw was something else, something in which the distinction between the cook and the task had grown so thin it was difficult to locate. The blade moved through the animal not by force, but by finding the natural spaces, the yielding places, the gaps where the anatomy offered passage rather than resistance. The cook explained afterward that he had long since stopped perceiving with his eyes. His spiritual intelligence was doing the work now, in a mode that was below or beyond the usual categories of plan and execute and evaluate. What has happened to the ego in that moment of perfect performance is not that it has been overcome by willpower or refined by long training into something harder and more capable. What has happened is that it has become transparent. The editorial self, the one that monitors and adjusts and is always partly watching from the outside, has stepped back far enough that action can flow without being slowed by its surveillance. The cook does not try to find the gaps. He does not think about where to place the blade. He is in a mode where the difference between intending and happening has dissolved, where the action and the space it moves through have arrived at something like mutual recognition. Dreaming, in Zhuangzi's world, has something of this quality. The dreaming mind does not stand apart from its experience and evaluate it. The dreamer inside the dream does not say, "This is a dream, these emotions are not real, I should maintain proper perspective on what I am feeling." The dreaming mind is inside its experience all the way the cook is inside his work. The man who weeps in his dream over something that feels absolute and irreversible is not wrong to weep. He is not confused or deficient. The grief is real within the structure in which it is occurring, as real as anything the waking world has ever offered. It is simply that the structure itself is temporary and will give way, and when it does, something else, the waking world with its own structures, will feel equally complete and authoritative and final. This is the point Zhuangzi is pressing when he tells us that those who dream of drinking wine may wake in the morning to grief, and those who dream of grief may wake to go out and hunt. The relationship between the emotional conviction and the state that produces it is identical from inside each state. No internal evidence distinguishes them. This is not disorienting. In Zhuangzi's telling, it is simply the nature of the transformation of things. Conviction accompanies whatever configuration is currently present. The configurations change. The conviction stays, moves into the next form, stays there too. There is a tradition arising in India in the centuries around Zhuangzi's own lifetime that came to a very similar place by a very different path. The teachers of what would become Buddhism were working through their own account of what a self actually is when examined carefully, and what they found was that the closer they looked, the more the seemingly solid and unified self dissolved into a collection of processes: perception, feeling, intention, consciousness, none of which, taken separately or together, amounted to a permanent and independent entity that could be called with confidence the self. They named this observation anatta, non-self, and they did not find it a cause for despair. They found it, repeatedly, a cause for relief. The weight that one had been carrying under the name of the self turned out, on examination, to be lighter than anyone had supposed. These two traditions, the Daoist and the Buddhist, arrived at their insights from different starting points, using different tools, in response to different questions. Zhuangzi approached the dissolution of the self through paradox and story, and the playful reversal of expectation. The Buddhist teachers approached it through systematic meditation and the careful analysis of moment-to-moment experience. What they share is the direction of the finding that what feels like the stable interior observer, the one who watches experience from a position of centrality and control, is not as stable or as central or as controlling as it appears. And what they share even more precisely is the response to this finding, not crisis, not the vertigo of a floor becoming uncertain, but something much closer to space, room, the particular quality of openness that comes when a structure one has been maintaining quietly and at great cost is no longer required. The dissolution of the fixed self does not arrive in Zhuangzi as an argument to be accepted or rejected. It arrives, characteristically, as an experience, the butterfly dream, the cook's perfect work, the moment of sitting beside a wife's body and singing. These are not illustrations of a theory, they are the theory. The philosophy is in the quality of experience they describe, in the felt sense of what it is to be in a mode where the usual maintenance of selfhood has been set aside and something quieter and more spacious has become available in its place. In this mode, it turns out, is not exotic. It is not available only to sages or to those who have spent decades in philosophical training. It is available every night. The person who closes their eyes and begins the slow dissolution of the waking day, who lets the plans dissolve and the obligations dissolve, in the particular social configuration of themselves that they have been maintaining through every interaction of the day, begin to lose its edges. That person is entering something that Zhuangzi's butterfly had already found. The name falls away. The debts and the appointments and the accumulated texture of the day's judgments fall away. What remains is not nothing, it is something older and less defended that the busy waking self has been resting on all along without knowing it. Zhuangzi does not romanticize this. He does not describe the dreaming mind as purer or more enlightened than the waking one. The butterfly is not more real than the man. The man is not more real than the butterfly. Each configuration has its own completeness, its own form of knowledge, its own way of being fully present to whatever presents itself within its terms. The cicada cannot understand the great bird's flight, and this is not the cicada's failure. The cicada is complete, and when the transformation comes, and the cicada is no longer a cicada, not dead, in Zhuangzi's understanding, but moved into another shape, whatever that next configuration is, will also be complete, will also know its own world from the inside, will also feel self-evidently real in the way that all inhabited experience feels self-evidently real. The social self, the one that carries the name and the debts and the appointments, knows this at some level. It knows because every morning it wakes from somewhere. Every morning it reassembles out of a state in which it was not monitoring itself, was not maintaining its own continuity, was not doing the constant work of being a particular person with a particular history and a particular set of expectations about tomorrow. And every morning the reassembly is easy. The self comes back, the name comes back, the obligations come back, but the ease of the reassembly is itself a kind of information. It suggests that what was set aside during the night was being carried rather than constituting the carrier. The carrier, whatever it is, persists through the setting aside. It is older than the name and quieter, and will still be there when the name is set down for the last time. This is the territory Zhuangzi was in when Huzi found him singing. He had set down the name, temporarily, and seen that something continued beneath it. He had followed the transformation far enough back to find the shape of it, not his wife's particular configuration, not his own, but the motion underlying both, the great ongoing change of which all particular forms are temporary expressions. The singing was not denial of the loss. It was acknowledgement of the transformation. It was a way of being in the same rhythm as what was happening, rather than standing against it, insisting that this particular configuration of his wife should have persisted, should have been exempt from the motion that moves everything. Later commentators would wonder whether Zhuangzi was being callous, whether his philosophy gave him too easy a way out of the difficulty of grief, whether the dissolution of the fixed self was in practice a way of avoiding the full weight of what personal loss actually requires a person to carry. These are honest questions. They deserve to be held honestly rather than waved away. What can be said is that Zhuangzi did not describe himself as free of the feeling. He said explicitly that when she first died, he had not been unmoved. The philosophy did not prevent the feeling. It provided a direction in which the feeling could travel that did not require it to stop at the fixed point of the lost configuration and stay there. Grief, in this understanding, is not a mistake. It is the recognition of a transformation, the particular note of one configuration being exchanged for the silence before the next. It is appropriate and real and human in the fullest sense. What Zhuangzi adds to it is a temporal widening, a view long enough and broad enough that the transformation itself becomes visible as the context in which the loss is occurring, and that context, while it does not make the loss smaller, makes it part of something continuous rather than something terminal. The person who lies down at the end of a day and begins to let the day's configurations dissolve is not losing anything that will not return in a different form. The thoughts that have been pressing all day, the unresolved conversations, the accumulated small embarrassments, the plans that are still only plans, will still be there in the morning, or they will not, and if they are not, the transformation will have already happened, and something else will have taken their place. The self that wakes tomorrow morning will be related to the one lying down, now, the way the seasons are related to each other, not identical, not discontinuous, connected by the ongoing motion of whatever is doing the transforming. There is a quality that Zhuangzi associates with this recognition, a mode of being in the world that he marks out through the figures of the sage and the perfect man across the inner chapters. It is not a quality of achievement or attainment. It is more like a quality of ease. The sage is not someone who has conquered the usual human difficulties. The sage is someone who has stopped experiencing them as conquests to be made. The great bird that flies 90,000 li does not work at flying. The river does not work at flowing. The cook does not work at butchering. And the person who has genuinely understood the transformation of things does not work at having the right self, because the question of which self is the right one has become less pressing. Less pressing not because it has been answered, but because its premise, the idea that there is a single right configuration that must be maintained against the tide of change, has quietly dissolved. This is not passivity. Zhuangzi was not describing a philosophy of withdrawal or inaction, despite what the surface of his refusals might suggest. What he was describing was action without the friction that comes from the ego insisting that the action conform to its image of what the ego should look like while acting. Cook Ding is not passive. He is fully present, fully engaged, moving with a precision and a responsiveness that no mechanical execution of technique could achieve. But he is not doing it for himself, in the sense that the monitoring self has stepped back far enough that the doing and the doer have arrived at something like the same address, and the performance is seamless, not because skill has overcome resistance, but because the distinction between performer and performance has become difficult to locate. Every night offers something like this address. The monitoring self, the one that has been watching all day to make sure the right self is being presented to the right people at the right moments, grows quiet. It does not vanish. It will be back in the morning, assembled again from the same tendencies and habits and memories, ready to resume its careful work. But in the hours between lying down and waking, it rests. And in its resting, what is underneath becomes briefly audible, not as a voice or a presence with particular content, but as a quality, the quality of something that does not need to be maintained, something that was there before the name was learned, and will be there when the day's obligations have all been satisfied and sat down for the final time. Zhuangzi, on the ground beside his wife's body, was in something like that quality while still awake. He had arrived there not by training or technique, but by following the transformation far enough back to feel the ground of it, the motion underlying the configurations, the change that does not stop at any particular form, but continues, always continues, into whatever comes next. And Husi stood in the entrance, watching, not yet able to follow. That is also the nature of it. Some configurations can find this place while awake, through long thought and the kind of honest attention that is willing to follow an idea past the point where it stops being comfortable. Most configurations find it only in the dark, in sleep, in the nightly dissolution that the body knows how to perform without being instructed. The breath changes, the eyes close, the particular weight of this particular self, with its particular name and its particular obligations and its particular unfinished conversations, begins to lighten, not because anything has been resolved, not because the thinking has arrived at an answer, but because the mode that requires resolution, the mode that insists that things be settled before the night can close, is itself settling. It is giving way to something older, something that has been underneath all along, something that knows, in the wordless way that only things without words can know, that the transformation is still happening, that everything is still moving, that the configurations come and go like seasons in the long motion of whatever the beginning was. The self that will wake in the morning will be the same self, and it will also not be the same self, and both of these are true in the way that the river is always the river and never the same water twice. For now, though, the river is still, or near enough to still, that the distinction no longer seems to require attention. The mushroom of a morning does not know the alternation of day and night, and this is its completeness. The chrysalis does not know what it is becoming, and this is not a deficiency. The dreaming mind does not know it is dreaming, and in the not knowing, it is fully, completely, entirely what it is, moving through whatever space the night offers, unencumbered by the machinery of a self that must be maintained, resting in something that does not need to be earned or assembled or defended, but simply allowed. And allowing it, as Zhuangzi seems to have understood, is not a loss. It is something much closer to a return, to the ground that was always there beneath the day's elaborate and necessary constructions, the ground that has no name because it preceded the naming, that has no shape because it precedes all the shapes, that continues in the way that transformation continues, not toward anything, not away from anything, but through everything, steadily, in the direction of whatever comes next. In the winter of 1641, in a house in the Dutch Republic, René Descartes sat down beside a fire in his dressing gown and began to write. The room was cold at its edges. The fire was the only moving thing. He had decided, on that particular morning, to do something that most people spend considerable effort avoiding, to call into question everything he had ever believed, not as an exercise in despair, but as the only way he could think of to find something that could not be doubted, something that would hold no matter how hard the questioning pressed against it. He set down his pen for a moment. He looked at his hands in the firelight and asked whether he could be certain they were real. What Descartes noticed first was not that the dream argument led anywhere alarming, but that it led anywhere at all. He had dreamed before, as everyone has, of being in a room very like the room he was in, of having hands very like the hands he had, of feeling the warmth of a fire that had no heat in it and yet felt warm, and there had been nothing inside the dream that announced itself as lesser or provisional or in need of correction. The experience had been complete. It had carried with it the full conviction of the waking world, and only the waking itself had revised that conviction, which meant the conviction could not be used as its own evidence. He wrote this down. He kept writing. The fire settled in the grate. What he was doing that morning, sitting alone, stripping away belief after belief to find what remained, was not, in the long history of this kind of questioning, a new activity. Somewhere in China, roughly 2,000 years before Descartes sat down in his dressing gown, a man named Zhuangzi had also arrived at the edge where what feels real and what is real begin to part from each other, and had also stayed to examine the gap. Neither man knew the other existed. Both of them had found, in the uncertainty itself, something unexpected. Not the crisis that uncertainty is supposed to produce, but a kind of quiet that the certainty they had been carrying around had never permitted. The connection between them is not a coincidence of cleverness. The question both men were circling, the question of whether the ground of ordinary experience is as solid as it feels, whether the self that seems to be doing the perceiving is as stable as it presents itself, is one of the oldest questions philosophy has, appearing in different forms across traditions that had no contact with each other, and arriving with a consistency that is itself worth noticing at similar edges, similar thresholds, similar pauses where the argument runs to the border of what any argument can reach. What is on the other side of that border is what the oldest philosophical traditions, in their very different ways, were always trying to find a language for. Descartes believed he had found solid ground again through the act of thinking itself. Whatever else could be doubted, the doubting was happening, and so something must be doing it, and that something, that bare act of thought, was the one thing his method of doubt could not dissolve. This is the move that distinguishes him most sharply from Zhuangzi, where Zhuangzi set down the butterfly dream and let it rest in its own uncertainty, naming the transformation of things and allowing the question of which identity was more real to simply remain unanswered. Descartes used the same threshold, the same felt impossibility of distinguishing waking from dreaming, from inside either state, as the first step in building back toward a unified, rational, self-identical subject. He wanted certainty. He wanted the foundation. He found it, at least to his own satisfaction, in the thinking self. Zhuangzi had not wanted that, or rather, the question of whether there was a stable thinking self to serve as foundation had not seemed, to Zhuangzi, to need the answer Descartes needed. The butterfly flew, the man woke. The word he reached for was not foundation, but transformation. Between those two words, foundation and transformation, lies much of the distance between two philosophical worlds that asked the same question and then answered it, or declined to answer it, in ways that shaped everything that followed in their respective traditions. There is a room in Plato's Republic, not a real room, but one that has been sitting in the philosophical imagination for long enough that it has the quality of a real room, in which a group of prisoners are chained facing a wall. They have always faced this wall. Behind them, a fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners, objects are carried whose shadows fall on the wall ahead. The prisoners have never seen the objects themselves, only their shadows, and so they have come to believe that the shadows are the full extent of what there is to see. Plato describes a prisoner being unchained, turned around, forced to look at the light, led eventually out of the cave entirely and into the sun, and the prisoner does not experience this as liberation. Not at first. The light hurts. The real objects are too much. The sun is nearly unbearable. Only slowly, over a long time, does the freed prisoner come to understand that what seemed real, the shadows, the cave, The whole familiar arrangement was a kind of dream, and that the world above ground is the actual world. Plato was doing something with this image that Zhuangzi was not doing with the butterfly. For Plato, the distinction between the shadow world and the world of forms is a distinction in kind. The world of forms is genuinely more real, more permanent, more fully existent than the world of appearances. The philosopher who has seen the sun has seen something the prisoner in the cave has not, and the difference between those two positions is not merely a difference of perspective. It is a difference of access to reality as such. Plato was constructing a hierarchy. The philosopher climbs it. The prisoners remain at the bottom, seeing what the philosopher once saw before the climb. Zhuangzi built no such ladder. When the man woke from the butterfly dream, neither state was higher than the other. The man experience was not a more reliable version of reality than the butterfly's. The butterfly's flight was not a diminished or provisional substitute for the waking man's perception. Both were configurations within the transformation of things. The word asterisk huahu, asterisk opening outward, like a hand releasing something into water, and neither was the master configuration, against which the other could be measured and found wanting. Where Plato's freed prisoner gains access to something genuinely more real, Zhuangzi's waking man discovers only that he has returned to one perspective from another, and that the word for what passes between them is change, not assent. This is a quieter philosophical position than Plato's. It requires less of the world. It asks no external hierarchy to validate the question, and offers no final revelation to the careful thinker who makes the right assent. What it offers instead is something harder to name and perhaps easier to rest inside, the loosening of the demand that one of the perspectives must be right, that the dream must be less real than the waking, that the butterfly must be a lesser version of the man. When that demand is loosened, the question does not disappear. It changes its character. It becomes in Zhuangzi's hands less a problem and more a place, the kind of place where a person can stay for a while without needing to leave. In the autumn of 1781, in Königsberg, a city on the Baltic that Immanuel Kant almost never left, a book arrived in the world that had taken 12 years to think and 11 months to write, and that attempted, among other things, to draw a precise line between what human consciousness can know and what lies permanently beyond the reach of any knowing. Kant called this line the boundary between the phenomenal and the noumenal, between the world as it appears within the structures that human consciousness brings to every act of perception, and the world as it is in itself, independent of any perceiver, standing free of every form of intuition and category. He was sure the boundary was real. He was equally sure no one could cross it. The structures that shape human experience, space, time, causality, are not features of the world encountered in perception, Kant argued. They are the forms that the mind brings to every encounter, the conditions that make any encounter possible at all. What is perceived is always the world as structured by mind, never the world in its naked self-sufficiency. The thing in itself, what Kant called the Ding an sich, remains inaccessible, not because it is hidden, but because the act of perceiving anything at all means bringing the mind's own forms to bear upon it, and those forms are always already present before the encounter begins. There is no way around them to whatever stands on the other side. Zhuangzi's perspectivism had arrived at something adjacent to this, though by a different path and with a different destination in view. In the asterisk equivalent asterisk, the chapter in which the butterfly dream appears, Zhuangzi argues that distinctions like right and wrong, large and small, real and illusory, are always made from a particular standpoint, and that there is no standpoint outside all standpoints from which the correct set of distinctions could be identified as universally valid. The cicada, laughing at the great bird whose flight it cannot comprehend, is not wrong from inside its own perspective. It simply cannot see far enough. The mushroom of a morning does not know the alternation of day and night, and this is not a deficiency in the mushroom. It is what a morning's scope looks like from inside it. Every perspective is internally complete and externally limited, which means no perspective, including the human one, including the philosophers, can claim to have stepped outside the series and found the view from nowhere. Where Kant used this recognition as the foundation for a systematic account of what universal knowledge is possible within the human perspective. Zhuangzi let the recognition rest more gently, without the systematic building project, suggesting that the diversity of perspectives across species and states of mind was not a problem to be overcome through the right method, but a feature of how things are, to be received rather than corrected. Kant was trying to establish the conditions for objective knowledge. Zhuangzi was trying to loosen the conviction that any particular perspective, however elaborate and internally consistent, constitutes objective knowledge as such. They arrived at similar edges and turned in different directions, one to build, one to open. The building and the opening are both honest philosophical responses to the same difficulty. The boundary between what can be known and what exceeds all knowing is real for both men. What differs is what they asked of the boundary, whether it was a place to stake the foundations of a system or a place to set down the need for a system and breathe. Near the end of the 19th century, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, William James sat at his desk and often at his window, and watching the Charles River, trying to find language for something he had noticed moving through his own mind that the existing philosophical vocabulary seemed unable to hold. Consciousness, as philosophers have typically described it, was made of states, clear, discrete units of experience that could be examined, catalogued, and compared. James found, when he looked at his own experience with the most careful attention he could bring to it, that what he found was not states, but something flowing, something continuous, something that resisted the snapshot categories. Philosophy wanted to impose upon it the way water resists being held in a hand. He settled on the word stream, not as a metaphor, exactly, or rather as a metaphor that was also a description of something he had genuinely watched moving through his own mind all morning. Consciousness as a stream, always moving, never stepping into the same current twice, carrying its objects the way a river carries what falls into it, not by holding them still, but by moving around and through them, keeping them in play as long as they are present, releasing them as they go. The self that inhabited this stream was not a fixed observer watching the show of experience from a stable position outside it. It was itself part of the stream, arising from it and returning to it, one more flowing thing among the rest. Zhuangzi had been watching something similar from a different shore. The self in the butterfly dream is not a fixed observer who temporarily visits the perspective of the butterfly and then returns to the stable ground of the waking man. In the dream, the man is not present at all. There is only the butterfly, complete in its flight, internally whole, nothing missing. And when the waking comes, the question that arrives is not how to reassert the waking man's identity over the butterfly's experience, but whether the two states can be understood as sequential configurations of a single unfolding process, neither one more real, neither one the baseline from which the other deviates, the transformation of things, not the return to a prior stability, the river reaching its own level, not the waking self recovering its ground. James called his version of this insight radical empiricism, a philosophy of pure experience in which relations between things are as real as the things themselves, and in which consciousness is a process rather than a substance, a doing rather than a having. Zhuangzi would not have used those words, and his path to the same neighborhood ran through Daoist cosmology and literary parable rather than through the protocols of 19th century psychology. But they were, in their different ways, watching the same stream from different vantage points, and what they saw in it was similar enough that reading one after the other can sometimes produce the mild vertigo of recognizing the same landscape through two different windows. In recent decades, a version of the ancient question has returned in a new form, dressed in the language of computation and information theory rather than the language of dreaming and the transformation of things, but recognizably the same question beneath its contemporary clothing. The philosopher Nick Bostrom proposed, in the early years of the 21st century, that the reality experienced might be a simulation, a computation generated by intelligences vastly more advanced than the ones inhabiting what they took to be the world, and that this possibility, strange as it sounds when first encountered, cannot be ruled out on the basis of anything available from inside the experience itself. The argument has a structural similarity to Zhuangzi's butterfly dream that its author would likely have acknowledged. From inside a sufficiently detailed simulation, nothing would feel simulated. The experiences would carry the full conviction of reality, just as the butterfly's flight carried no awareness of being a dream, just as Descartes' hands in the firelight felt solid and warm until the dream argument made their solidity a question. The problem of the criterion, the impossibility of adjudicating between states of experience using only the tools available from inside one of them, runs through all of these framings, ancient and contemporary, Eastern and Western, arriving each time at the same threshold. What distinguishes Zhuangzi from Bostrom and from Descartes and Plato, though in different ways, is his disinterest in the question of what would be found if the investigation succeeded. Bostrom's simulation argument implies a hierarchy. If this is a simulation, there is a deeper level of reality from which it is being run, and the truth about what is real sits at that deeper level. Descartes' dream argument was in service of finding the bedrock, the asterisk cogito asterisk, from which a secure account of reality could be rebuilt. Plato's cave implied the sun, the real world above ground, the forms that cast the shadows. Each of these framings uses the destabilization of ordinary certainty as a temporary measure in service of finding a more reliable ground beneath. Zhuangzi used the same destabilization and then did not move toward the deeper ground. He set down the butterfly dream at the end of his argument and named what passed between the two states, not hierarchy, but transformation. There is no more real world being asked for. There is no bedrock being sought. The loosening of certainty is not a preparation for a better certainty. It is, in Zhuangzi's hands, something closer to a destination, or rather, something closer to the recognition that destination was never quite the right word for what the questioning was moving toward. This is why the butterfly dream has aged so differently from the other great skeptical thought experiments of the philosophical tradition. Descartes' demon, Plato's cave, Bostrom's simulation, all of them create a problem that the thinker then works to solve or to place within a framework that makes sense of it. The butterfly dream creates something more like a pause, a held breath, the moment of waking in which both states are briefly present at once, and neither has yet fully asserted its claim, and the philosopher simply remains there, in the pause, at the threshold, and observes that this is where things actually are, not on either side, but in the turning between. Sitting beside that pause for long enough, the traditions begin to look less like rivals and more like people gathered around the same fire from different distances, each of them describing what the fire looks like from where they are standing. Descartes, alone in his winter room, working methodically toward the one thing that could not be doubted. Plato, reaching for the sun above the cave, committed to the conviction that the ascent is real and the destination genuinely brighter. Kant, in Königsberg, drawing his careful line between the knowable and the inaccessible, insisting that the line itself is what makes knowledge possible. James, watching the river, letting the stream carry what it carries, finding a vocabulary for something that had always been moving and had never been quite named. And Zhuangzi, in a garden in Meng, setting down the image of a butterfly at the end of a long philosophical argument and letting the question simply rest there, unanswered, as if the resting were the answer. None of them was wrong. None of them completed the inquiry. The questions they were circling are old enough that the word old feels insufficient for them. They predate every philosophical tradition that has claimed them, and they will continue in some form long after the traditions themselves have been transformed into what their successors will carry forward, and also find insufficient, also return to, also set down gently at the end of a long argument, and leave to rest. What the long history of this questioning offers, not as a solution, but as a kind of company, is the recognition that the uncertainty itself is not a sign that something has gone wrong with the thinking. Descartes doubted because he was rigorous. Plato reached because he was committed. Kant drew the line because he was honest about what the line meant for the possibilities of knowing. James watched the stream because he looked carefully at his own experience rather than at the theory of his experience, and found something the theory had smoothed over. Zhuangzi let the butterfly fly and the man wake and the question remain, because he understood that the transformation between the two was itself the thing to notice, and that naming the transformation without resolving it into a hierarchy was not an evasion, but a precision. All of these are ways of remaining at the threshold, rather than rushing to either side of it. All of them are honest responses to the same difficulty, and the fact that very different minds, in very different centuries and cultures, kept arriving at this same threshold and finding it worth staying at, kept returning to the same question about what the self is, what experience is, whether the world that feels solid is the only world, whether the boundary between dreaming and waking is as firm as the morning insists, suggests that the threshold is real, that the question is not a philosopher's invention, but something built into the structure of having a mind at all. The fire in Descartes' room has been out for centuries now. The cave in Plato's Republic stands empty of its prisoners. Kant's Königsberg has been renamed and rebuilt. The Charles River still moves past Cambridge, carrying whatever falls into it the way it always has, releasing it the way it always has, keeping nothing. And the butterfly dream still sits at the end of the asterisk, qui walun asterisk, in the same place Zhuangzi left it, the image of a man who woke from flight and asked without urgency, without despair, without a method for resolving the question, which direction the transformation ran. There is no answer waiting that the previous 2,000 years of careful questioning has failed to retrieve. The question is not holding out on anyone